He saw Prince walk into the morgue after the world had already pronounced him dead. And that night, they forced him into silence. For years, he carried the weight of that impossible memory, bound by fear and secrecy. But the vision of what happened inside that morgue never released him. And tonight, the silence finally breaks. It began on an ordinary evening, the kind of shift that passed like every other, quiet and uneventful, the kind of night that never wrote itself into memory. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above him, their hum a constant companion to the cold sterility of the hospital's lower halls. The air smelled faintly of bleach, sharp and chemical, with that undertone of stillness that only morgues seemed to hold. He had done this work for long enough to know the rhythm of nights like this. Paperwork, idle thoughts, maybe a transfer or two. Nothing special. And then the phone rang. At first, he didn't think much of it. Calls came in, bodies came in. That was the nature of the work, but the tone of the voice on the other end cut through his bones. Low, commanding, urgent. A body was being brought in, but this was not just another case. It was described as high profile. Those two words alone carried weight. He was told to prepare the morgue immediately. No questions asked. No delays tolerated. His mind tried to dismiss it. High profile could mean a politician, a businessman, maybe even someone from television. It didn't have to mean anything unusual. But there was something in the caller's voice, a tightness that made his pulse quicken. This wasn't a request. It was an order. Minutes passed. He went about the motions, straightening sheets, checking instruments, pretending his hands weren't shaking. And then he heard it. A whisper at the end of the corridor. Not words meant for him, not spoken loud enough to be official. Just a name carried in hushed tones, spoken with disbelief. Prince. The sound of it stopped him where he stood. His chest tightened, and for a moment, he forgot how to breathe. Prince? The name felt too big for this sterile place, too electric for the cold walls of a morgue. The very idea seemed absurd. Prince didn't belong here. Prince belonged to arenas glowing in purple light, to music that poured into the bones of anyone who listened, to stages where he seemed untouchable, immortal. But the whispers continued, multiplying, spreading like wildfire through the staff. Someone down the hall swore they'd seen the news on a phone screen. Another said it couldn't be true, that it had to be a mistake. A nurse covered her mouth, eyes wide, while others leaned in close, whispering faster, quieter, as if speaking the words out loud might make them real. Prince. The name beat in his skull. It didn't make sense. Icons like him didn't die the way ordinary men did. They lived forever in music, in memory, in legend. And yet, here he was, standing in the quiet of a hospital morgue, with orders to prepare for the arrival of a body he prayed wasn't who they said it was. The air shifted then, heavier somehow, as though the walls themselves knew what was coming. The minutes stretched thin. He couldn't escape the feeling that the ground beneath him was no longer steady, that the world above and the world below were sliding toward a collision that no one could stop. And then the call came again. A voice, flat and certain. Stand ready. The van is on its way. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. This was no rumor now. This was no mistake whispered in the dark. The words were final, unshakable. Prince was gone. The thought hollowed him out. He remembered the first time he'd heard that voice on the radio, the way it carried velvet and fire in equal measure. He remembered the colors, the spectacle, the feeling of being pulled into something larger than life. To imagine that same man reduced to stillness, to silence, to a cold body on a stretcher, was almost unbearable. And yet, that was exactly what was about to happen. The world outside still didn't know the full truth. Fans were still clinging to hope, still refreshing screens for updates, still praying it was all some cruel mistake. But here, in the underbelly of the hospital, the truth was arriving on wheels. The hallway grew quieter. Every shuffle of shoes, every breath of air seemed to pause. Staff who had been whispering now stood still, waiting. Some bowed their heads, others turned away. It was as though a wave of reverence had swept over them. A recognition that this was not just a man being brought in, but a legend being laid to rest. His chest rose and fell unevenly as he stood at the edge of the room staring at the empty doorway where, any moment now, the van would appear. A shiver crept through him. It wasn't just the chill of the morgue. It was the knowledge that history was about to roll through those doors, zipped into black fabric. And when it did, nothing could prepare him for what he would see inside that body bag. The van arrived just past midnight. Its headlights washed against the concrete walls outside the service entrance, casting long, pale shadows that made the hospital grounds look like something out of a dream. The air outside was cool and damp, the kind of night where every sound seemed sharper, every breath a little heavier. Inside the morgue, he stood waiting, his hands damp against the fabric of his pockets, his pulse uneven. He had seen vans like this countless times. They came with bodies from accidents, from homes, from quiet deaths in empty apartments. But this van carried a weight unlike any other. Even before the back doors opened, the silence around it spoke volumes. No one joked, no one muttered. The staff who gathered at the edges of the corridor simply waited, their faces taut, their eyes lowered. And then the latch clicked. The doors swung open. The stretcher was wheeled out slowly, reverently, its wheels whispering against the floor. At first it looked no different than any other. A dark body bag, zipped tight, sealed against the world, but he could feel it. The atmosphere changed the moment it crossed the threshold. It was as though the air had grown heavier, as though the walls themselves leaned inward to witness the passage of a king. He caught sight of the little details. The tag clipped to the zipper, the faint glint of something purple near the wrist, barely visible through the seam of the bag. The whispers in the hall had been true. He didn't need to see the face to know who lay inside. His heart sank with the weight of realization. Prince. The man whose voice had once shaken stadiums, whose fingers had danced across strings and keys as if they were extensions of his soul, now reduced to stillness. No sound, no light. Just a body being wheeled into a sterile room that smelled of bleach and steel. For a moment, his mind fought against it. He remembered images from years ago. Prince standing tall on stage, drenched in purple light, holding an audience in the palm of his hand. That man had seemed untouchable, almost divine. And now, here he was, zipped away, silenced. The contrast was unbearable. The staff moved quickly but quietly, guiding the stretcher into place. No one dared speak louder than a whisper. It wasn't like the arrival of any other patient. It felt ceremonial, almost sacred, as though they were standing in the presence of something larger than themselves. A nurse crossed herself. Another wiped her eyes before turning away. He tried not to stare, but his gaze was drawn to the bag. His chest tightened with every breath. This wasn't just another shift. This was history, and he was standing in its shadow. The stretcher was secured against the cold table. The metallic click of locks echoed louder than it should have, the sound cutting through the silence like a blade. The morgue's fluorescent lights seemed harsher now, their glow falling across the bag in a way that made the contours of the body beneath undeniable. Shoulders, arms, the faint rise where a chest once rose with music. He felt his stomach twist. This wasn't just a man. This was the body of someone who had belonged to millions. Someone who had carried an entire era on his back. Someone whose songs had carved themselves into the marrow of the world. And now he was here, in this cold room, his body no different than the nameless faces who came before him. But death had a way of leveling legends. Icons or not, everyone ended up here eventually. That was what he tried to tell himself. That was what he clung to. And yet, something inside him whispered otherwise. The silence in the room was too deep, too heavy. The air pressed in like a weight. He had stood in this room 100 times before, but never like this. Never with a feeling that the walls themselves were holding their breath. He wanted to look away. He wanted to walk out. But his feet were rooted in place, his eyes drawn to that zipper, to the stillness inside. He had never felt so close to the edge of something unknown, something that didn't fit within the walls of science or reason. Around him, the others exchanged uneasy glances. No one wanted to be the first to break the silence. No one dared say his name out loud. And so, the room held its breath, waiting. He swallowed hard. He knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end. Not yet. Because if this was only death, why did the silence feel alive? The stretcher had barely been secured when the supervisors arrived. Not doctors, not nurses, but administrators in dark suits, their shoes clicking sharply against the tile floor. They didn't belong in the morgue, not usually, and their sudden presence only thickened the air. The staff stiffened, eyes darting between them. Something about their arrival whispered of control, of secrets that demand to be buried with the dead. They didn't waste time with pleasantries. The tallest of the men stepped forward, his voice sharp and deliberate. Listen carefully. No one speaks of what happens here tonight. Not to family, not to friends, not to the press. Do you understand? The words cut through the room. Everyone nodded, but the unease in their faces betrayed them. Another supervisor stepped in, carrying a stack of papers. He began passing them out, non-disclosure agreements, thick and formal, covered in small print that left no room for loopholes. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. The message was clear. Silence wasn't just expected. It was required. He took the paper in his hands, his pulse loud in his ears. This wasn't normal. Confidentiality was always implied in their work, of course. The dead deserved dignity. Families deserved privacy. But this felt different. The language on the page was heavy, threatening. Violations wouldn't mean suspension or a fine. They spoke of lawsuits, prison, ruin. And beneath those words, something deeper trembled. He couldn't explain it, but the warning felt older than paper, heavier than law. It was as though the silence they demanded wasn't only to protect reputations, it was to shield them from something they didn't dare name. The staff began signing. Pens scratched against paper in nervous hands. Some didn't even read the text, too afraid to hesitate. One woman bit her lip as she scrawled her name, tears brimming in her eyes. When it was his turn, he hesitated. The pen hovered over the line. His chest felt tight, as though the paper itself weighed 100 pounds. He knew once he signed, there was no going back. His life, his truth, would no longer be his own. He was about to surrender not just his voice, but his freedom to ever speak of what was about to unfold. He thought of asking why. He thought of raising his head and demanding answers. But the supervisor's eyes caught his, cold, unblinking, unwavering. The kind of stare that told him questions would not be tolerated. So he signed. The pen carved his name onto the line, and with it, the invisible chains of silence tightened around his throat. When the last paper was collected, the tall supervisor stepped forward again. His tone softened, but only slightly. For the sake of your careers, and for the sake of your lives, you will keep this to yourselves. Consider this your oath. The words sank into him like ice. For the sake of your lives. Was it just a phrase meant to scare them? Or was it a warning? The supervisors left as quickly as they had entered, their presence lingering like a shadow. The room was silent again, but the silence felt poisoned now, corrupted by the weight of what they had agreed to. He turned back toward the stretcher. The body bag was still, zipped tight, as though nothing about it had changed. But his chest told him otherwise. Something in that bag didn't belong to the rules of this world. Something about it demanded silence because the truth would unravel everything. He swallowed hard, forcing down the knot in his throat. His hands trembled at his sides. He told himself it was just nerves, just the pressure of the moment. But deep down, he knew better. The oath wasn't meant to protect the hospital. It wasn't meant to protect the supervisors. It was meant to protect them from whatever was about to happen. And in that moment, he realized something terrifying. This wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. And then, in the dead of night, when he thought he was finally alone, the impossible happened. The morgue settled into silence again once the supervisors had gone. The papers were locked away, the warnings still echoing in his ears. The staff drifted off one by one, until at last he was left alone in the cold, sterile room. He told himself this was routine. Someone had to monitor the body through the night. He had done it before. He could do it again. But this wasn't routine. Nothing about tonight felt normal. The fluorescent lights above flickered faintly, buzzing like trapped insects. The air seemed thicker than usual, each breath heavier than the last. He glanced at the clock on the far wall, watching the minutes drag. His pulse never slowed. Every sound, the click of pipes, the faint rattle of air vents, seemed amplified, like the building itself was holding its breath. He tried to busy himself, shuffling papers, checking instruments, anything to keep his mind away from the thought of what lay zipped inside the bag only a few feet away. But no matter how hard he tried, his eyes drifted back to it. The shape beneath the black fabric was unmistakable. Shoulders, arms, the faint slope of a chest. too real, too final. He sat for a moment, staring. The silence grew heavier, pressing into his ears until it felt like static. He shook his head, told himself to stop. It was only a body, just another body, but the thought rang hollow. This wasn't just anyone. Minutes became hours. He shifted in his chair, rubbed his eyes, tried to fight the weight of fatigue. The morgues was cold, but sweat gathered at his temples. His nerves were raw, stretched thin. And then it happened. A sound. Soft at first, so faint he almost dismissed it as his imagination. A faint rustle, like fabric shifting against itself. He froze. His eyes darted toward the stretcher. The body bag was still. He held his breath, straining to listen. There it was again. Louder this time. A muffled scrape from inside the bag. His chest tightened. Number. It wasn't possible. He leaned forward, every muscle stiff. The sound came once more, deliberate, heavy, as though something inside had moved. His mind raced. Logic screamed explanations. Settling of the bag. Air trapped in the fabric. The cold making things shift. That was all. That had to be all. But his gut twisted with a certainty he couldn't ignore. This wasn't the sound of a bag shifting on its own. This was movement. His chair creaked as he stood. Slowly, cautiously, he stepped closer. The bag lay still under the harsh glow of the lights, zipper glinting faintly, but the silence around it was alive now, charged, vibrating with tension. He stopped only a foot away, staring. His throat was dry, his hands shaking. The morgue had never felt colder. And then, before his eyes, the fabric of the bag shifted. Just slightly. Enough to make the zipper tremble. He staggered back, nearly losing his footing. His heart thundered so violently he thought it might burst. He couldn't look away. The bag moved again, this time with more force. A bulge rose near the chest, pressing outward as though something beneath was pushing against the fabric. His mind broke against the sight. Number. This wasn't happening. The man was dead. Pronounced. Certified. Everyone knew it. This couldn't be real. But it was. The bulge pressed harder, straining against the zipper. And then, slowly, a shape formed. A hand. The outline of fingers spread wide against the fabric, pressing up, clawing at the inside of the bag. He gasped, stumbling back into the counter behind him. A tray rattled, nearly spilling onto the floor. He barely noticed. His eyes were locked on the hand, frozen in horror. And then it withdrew. The bag fell still again. The silence that followed was unbearable. He stood there, chest heaving, sweat running down his neck, every nerve screaming. He wanted to run. He wanted to scream, but his feet wouldn't move, his throat locked tight. Seconds passed like hours. The morgue seemed darker now, the corners thicker, the air heavier. He knew what he had seen. It wasn't imagination. It wasn't exhaustion. He had seen the hand. The stillness broke once more. The bag shifted again, and this time the entire length of the zipper trembled. Slowly, agonizingly, the body inside sat up. But sitting up was only the beginning, because what happened next defied everything he thought he knew about life and death. The bag unzipped on its own. That was the first impossible detail. There was no one near it. no hand tugging at the metal, and yet the teeth of the zipper pulled apart with a slow, deliberate rasp that sliced through the silence like a blade. The sound echoed in the sterile room, louder than it had any right to be. He pressed back against the counter, every nerve in his body firing at once. He should have run. He should have called someone. But his legs locked in place, rooted to the floor as though the cold tiles themselves held him there. The bag opened halfway before it stopped. For a moment, nothing happened. The silence roared in his ears, his pulse hammering in his throat. And then, from within the darkness of the bag, movement stirred. First the shoulders shifting beneath the fabric, then the arms. Slowly, painfully, as though fighting against invisible chains, the body sat upright. It wasn't clumsy, it wasn't jerky, the way a corpse might move if some cruel trick of nerves made it twitch. Number. This was steady, controlled, intentional. The man who had been declared dead, the man whose body had been delivered into silence, sat up as though rising from sleep. His face was pale, waxen under the glow of fluorescent lights, but unmistakable. The sharp lines, the iconic profile, it was him. Prince. The sight hit him like a blow. His breath caught in his chest, his knees threatening to buckle. His mind screamed for reason, for logic, for something to explain what his eyes were seeing. But there was no explanation. There was only this. The dead were not supposed to sit up. And yet, here he was, rising with impossible grace. The bag slid from his shoulders, crumpling against the stretcher as he pushed himself upright. His head tilted forward, dark curls fallen across his forehead, his eyes closed as if he were still somewhere between worlds. And then he stood. Not slowly, not with the unsteadiness of death defied. He rose to his feet in a single fluid motion, as though gravity itself bent differently for him. His bare feet touched the floor with quiet finality. The air shifted instantly. It thickened, humming faintly, charged like the seconds before a storm. A faint scent, metallic and electric, filled the room. Ozone, sharp and alien. He could almost hear it too, like the faint pluck of a guitar string vibrating in the air, notes no one else could catch. Prince began to walk. The morgue was long, sterile, endless in its silence. Each step echoed faintly, though it was more than sound. It was vibration. Each footfall pulsed through the floor, up into the bones of the man watching, until he thought his body would rattle apart under the weight of it. The figure didn't stagger. He didn't drag his limbs like some reanimated puppet. He moved with poise, with that same unearthly confidence he had carried on stage. Shoulders back, chin lifted slightly, each step precise and commanding. His lips moved as he walked. Words formed, though no sound carried. It was like watching a song without melody, a verse mouthed in silence. The man strained to read them, but they were unlike any words he knew. Strange syllables, strange rhythm, as though they belonged to a language not spoken on this earth. The figure slowed, and then, for the first time, he opened his eyes. The man watching would never forget it. The gaze was piercing, eternal, burning with something he couldn't name. It wasn't anger. It wasn't peace. It was recognition, as though Prince's eyes were not just looking at him, but into him, through him, pulling apart every memory, every thought. leaving him naked under their weight. The moment lasted only a heartbeat, but it was enough. And then, just as suddenly as he had risen, the figure turned and began to walk again, past the stretchers, past the trays of instruments, toward the cold corridor that stretched beyond the morgue doors. The man couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. All he could do was watch as the impossible passed by him, the scent of ozone clinging to the air, the silent hum of strings vibrating in his skull. The corridor swallowed him. The figure disappeared into shadow. And then the morgue was silent once more. The bag still lay open on the stretcher, crumpled and empty, as if mocking the very idea of what had been inside. And just when he thought his mind had shattered completely, the nightmare deepened, because the others would return, and the body would be back where it started. The morgue was silent again. The air hung heavy, unmoving, as though the walls themselves were waiting for him to speak, to scream, to run. But he did none of those things. He stood frozen, staring at the corridor where the figure had vanished, his hands trembling, his chest heaving in shallow bursts of breath. It had happened. He knew it had. He had seen the body rise. He had seen Prince walk. He had felt the vibration of footsteps shaking through the floor. But now, as the moment stretched thin, doubt began clawing at the edges of his mind. Was he losing his grip? Could exhaustion have played some cruel trick on his eyes? Could the mind, stretched thin with fear and silence, invent something so vivid? Before he could untangle the knot of his thoughts, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the hall. Not those impossible, unearthly steps. These were ordinary, heavy, human. His stomach sank. The others were coming back. The door creaked open and staff filtered in, whispering among themselves, carrying clipboards, checking instruments. The night had rolled on. Duties had shifted. And now, the morgue was no longer his alone. He turned sharply, his eyes darting to the stretcher, to the crumpled bag that had lain empty only minutes before. His heart nearly stopped. The body was back. There it was, zipped neatly into place, lying still on the table as though it had never moved. Pale face visible through the slight gap in the fabric. Arms stiff, chest unmoving. Prince, returned to death as though nothing had ever happened. He staggered back a step, his head spinning. How? How was it possible? He hadn't imagined the unzip, the hand pressing outward, the figure walking past him. He hadn't conjured the smell of ozone or the weight of that piercing gaze. It had been real. He knew it. And yet, here, the body lay, lifeless, untouched. The staff moved around casually, recording notes, checking tags, muttering instructions to one another. None of them seemed surprised. None of them acted as if anything was amiss. The sight of the legend lying cold before them should have drawn gasps, tears, reverence. Instead, they worked with quiet efficiency, their faces drawn tight, their eyes carefully avoiding the body. It dawned on him slowly, chillingly. They knew. Maybe not the details, maybe not everything, but they knew something. Their silence was too deliberate, their avoidance too careful. It was as if they too were bound by the same chains, forced to look at what lay before them and pretend it was only a body, pretend that nothing more had ever happened. He wanted to speak. He wanted to demand. Did you see it? Did you hear the zipper? Did you feel the air shift? but the words lodged in his throat, choked by the memory of the papers he had signed, the oath that weighed heavier with every second. For the sake of your careers, for the sake of your lives. So he kept silent. He watched. He trembled. And inside him, panic roared louder than ever. The others left eventually, the morgue quieting once more. But the silence wasn't the same. It wasn't clean. It wasn't still. It was poisoned, full of tension, full of memory. He stared at the body that now looked perfectly ordinary and knew that what he had witnessed was no dream. When his shift ended, he walked out into the cool night air, but the outside world didn't feel like freedom. The silence followed him. The footsteps echoed in his mind, step after step after step, looping endlessly. Every purple banner, every song playing faintly from a passing car clawed open the wound of that night. He knew then that he wasn't walking away from it. The morgue hadn't been just a workplace, not that night. It had become a prison. And though the supervisors thought the papers were enough to silence him, the truth was far worse. The silence wasn't just forced. It was alive, clinging to him, binding him tighter each time he tried to breathe. And as the days turned to weeks, he discovered something even more terrifying. The silence outside was nothing compared to the torment that followed him home. The torment began in whispers. At first, he thought it was only memory replaying itself, his mind struggling to process the impossible. But memory didn't echo through walls, didn't carry weight in the air, didn't follow him into his own home. Nights became his enemy. When the sun fell and the house grew quiet, the silence sharpened into something oppressive. He would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to drown his thoughts in exhaustion. And then he'd hear it, faint, almost delicate, a whisper in the dark. Words too low to catch, rhythm too strange to understand. He told himself it was the creak of pipes, the shifting of old wood. But deep down, he recognized it. The cadence was the same as that silent chant he had seen Prince mouthing as he walked across the morgue floor. A string of syllables that didn't belong to this world. The whispers never came in daylight. They belonged to the night, when everything around him was still. They slipped into his ears when he was most vulnerable, carrying with them the chill of that morgue, the smell of ozone, the impossible sight of lifeless eyes burning with recognition. Soon it wasn't just whispers. The footsteps returned. The first time, he nearly convinced himself it was a neighbor in the hall. He lived in an old building. Sounds traveled. Doors groaned. But then he realized the steps weren't outside. They were inside. Inside his apartment. He sat up in bed, his skin prickling, his breath frozen. The sound was unmistakable. Bare feet against the floor. Slow, deliberate, echoing the same rhythm that had rattled through the tiles of the morgue. Step after step, moving closer, then stopping. Always stopping just before his bedroom door. He would sit there, shaking, eyes locked on the crack beneath the door, waiting for a shadow to appear. But none ever came. The silence would return, leaving him trembling in the dark. Days bled into nights, nights into weeks. He tried to live normally. He went to work. He kept his head down. He followed the rules. But every time he passed a poster of Prince, every time a song spilled from a passing car, his chest seized. The music wasn't just music anymore. It was a reminder, a trigger. Every lyric, Every note seemed aimed directly at him, pulling him back into that cold room. He began avoiding people. Friends noticed his silence. He offered excuses, long shifts, exhaustion, stress. But the truth was harder to confess. How could he explain that he was haunted not by a ghost, but by the impossible truth of a man who had defied death, if only for a moment? How could he explain that he carried a secret heavier than grief, heavier than guilt? Because the silence wasn't just keeping him quiet, it was eating him alive. There were moments when he thought about breaking it, about confessing to someone, anyone, just to release the pressure. But each time the memory of the supervisor's words stopped him cold. For the sake of your career, for the sake of your lives. The phrase replayed endlessly, as if it had been carved into his skull. He didn't know if it was a legal threat or something far darker, but either way, the cost of speaking felt unbearable. So he kept silent, and the silence became a cage. It wasn't only his nights that betrayed him. In crowded streets, he swore he felt a presence just behind him. In grocery stores, in hospital corridors, in the hum of city noise, he would hear a single footstep out of place. He would turn, searching for a face, for confirmation, but no one was ever there. Sleep offered no refuge. When his eyes finally closed, dreams carried him back to that morgue. Always the same. The zipper trembling, the bag rising, the impossible walk past him, and silent lips whispering words he couldn't understand. And always, the eyes. That gaze that cut through him and branded him with something he could never wash away. He began to fear sleep as much as waking. And yet, for all his fear, part of him understood something else, something he could never admit even to himself. The silence wasn't just torment. It was an invitation, a pull, a reminder that what he had seen wasn't finished. And deep down, though he fought against it with every breath, he knew the truth. The impossible moment he had witnessed wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. But after years of carrying this burden, he would finally reach the point where silence itself became unbearable, and he would decide to break the oath. Years blurred together under the weight of silence. Seasons came and went, yet the memory of that night remained sharp, unyielding, like a shard of glass embedded in his mind. He carried it to work, carried it on crowded trains, carried it through the hollow hours of sleepless nights. And though the world mourned, though fans lit candles and sang his songs in trembling voices, no one knew what he knew. The secret gnawed at him, hollowing him out from the inside. At first he tried to live with it, convincing himself he could endure. But silence has a way of growing heavier the longer it lingers. What had begun as fear turned to obsession. He replayed the night in the morgue endlessly, the zipper parting, the body sitting up, the gaze that marked him forever. The silence was no longer an oath. It was a curse. Everywhere he went, he carried the echo of those footsteps. They rattled through him like a second heartbeat, steady and unrelenting. He could hear them beneath music, beneath conversation, beneath the noise of traffic. Always there, always walking toward him. He began to notice the strain in his reflection. His eyes looked hollow, shadowed by sleeplessness. His shoulders hunched beneath invisible weight. Friends asked if he was all right, but he brushed them off with thin excuses. He couldn't tell them the truth. He couldn't hand them the burden that had nearly destroyed him. But inside, something was shifting. The silence, once terrifying, was turning into something worse. It was suffocating. It was unbearable. Each day he stayed quiet. The chain around his throat pulled tighter. One night, the breaking point came. He sat in his apartment, the lights dim, a record spinning faintly on the turntable. The room smelled faintly of dust and stale air. He wasn't listening to the music. He couldn't. Every note blurred into whispers, every pause between verses filled with phantom steps. He leaned forward in his chair, elbows on his knees, face in his hands, trembling. And then he heard it again. The footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing across the floor of his apartment. They came from the hall, moving toward him, steady as ever. His breath caught, his chest tightening. He lifted his head, staring at the darkened doorway. The steps stopped just beyond the frame. He waited for the shadow, for the handle to turn again. But this time, there was nothing. Only silence. The silence stretched until it felt like the air itself was choking him. His pulse thundered in his ears. And in that moment, something inside him snapped. He whispered aloud for the first time, his voice raw and shaking. "I can't do this anymore." The words broke something open. He felt it in his chest, in the air around him. The silence recoiled, pressing tighter, but he didn't stop. They told me to stay quiet. They made me sign. They made me swear. His voice rose, louder now, trembling with defiance. But I saw it. I saw him walk, and I can't keep it inside anymore. The room trembled with the weight of his confession, though no one else was there to hear it. Still, he knew it mattered. Speaking the words out loud was an act of rebellion, a crack in the wall that had imprisoned him for years. His eyes burned with tears he hadn't realized he'd been holding. For the first time since that night, he felt something shift. Not relief, not freedom, but the first step toward it. He wiped his face with trembling hands and leaned back in his chair. His breathing was ragged, but his resolve had solidified. The silence would not win. Not anymore. If the world refused to know the truth, he would carry it alone no longer. The oath, the warnings, the threats, they no longer mattered. The weight of silence had become heavier than the danger of speaking. He knew then that he would tell the story. He didn't know when, or how, or to whom, but he would. Because the truth wasn't his enemy. The silence was. And once that decision was made, there was no turning back. But he didn't yet realize that breaking his silence would not set him free. It would only awaken what had been waiting for him all along. The decision to break the silence came with a cost. The moment he whispered the words into the air of his apartment, something shifted. Subtle at first, a heaviness in the room, a stillness pressing against his chest like unseen eyes. He thought confession would free him, that it would lighten the weight he'd carried for so long. Instead, it chained him tighter. The whispers grew louder. What had once been faint murmurs turned sharp and deliberate, circling him, filling the spaces between his heartbeats. They weren't in his head. They were around him. At night, the footsteps no longer stopped outside his door. They came inside, bare feet against the floor, slow and deliberate, pausing at the foot of his bed. He never lifted his eyes. He didn't have to. He knew who it was. Prince. Not the man adored in purple and gold, but the figure from the morgue. pale, silent, walking with impossible grace. And still he tried to fight back. He wrote obsessively, filling notebooks with every detail, the zipper parting, the impossible walk, the gaze that pierced through him. Yet even as he wrote, his hands shook. The words didn't feel like his own. Sometimes the handwriting looked strange, jagged, as if guided by someone else. The silence fought him in return. Lights flickered, shadows shifted, doors groaned. Each attempt to put truth into words was met with warnings, but he pressed forward. He told himself it was the only way to survive. One stormy night, he finally spoke the full truth aloud. His voice trembled, but the words were clear. I saw Prince walk into the morgue after he was already pronounced dead. The room held its breath. For one fragile moment, he thought he was free. Then came the footsteps. Not faint, not distant, inside the room. Each step cracked like thunder, and then the figure appeared. Eyes half-lidded, lips moving in that unearthly chant. Every step rattled the glass, shook the desk beneath his hands. The gaze locked on him again, piercing, eternal. In that instant, he understood. The silence had never protected the world. It had protected him. And now it had delivered him. The figure stopped a breath away. The whispers swelled to a chorus, filling his skull until it felt like it would split. And then it vanished. The room was empty, but he knew the silence hadn't left him. It never would. The years that followed brought no peace. Time did not dull the memory. It sharpened it. The silence clung to him like a second skin, and no matter how far he walked, how many days he endured, it was always there, waiting in the corners of every room. At night, the torment deepened. The footsteps returned again and again, steady, patient, deliberate. Sometimes they stopped in the hall, sometimes by his bed, and sometimes he swore he felt the floor dip beneath their weight, as if the figure was standing right beside him. The whispers no longer faded with dawn. They bled into daylight, curling into his ears when he least expected them, woven into the notes of songs playing faintly in stores, hidden in the murmur of passing conversations. He began to hear the chant in everything. He knew then that silence had never been an oath. It was a chain, binding him not to secrecy, but to the impossible truth he had witnessed. And chains like that could never be broken. The world outside still remembered Prince as legend, immortal in music, eternal in memory. But he alone carried the vision of what happened after. The sight of a man who should not have moved, who should not have walked, yet did. And though he had spoken, though he had broken the rules meant to cage him, the silence had not lifted. It had only grown heavier. On the darkest nights, when the whispers swelled and the footsteps crept closer, he understood what was coming. One night soon, the steps would not stop at his door. They would keep going. And when that moment arrived, he knew the silence would claim him too.